big one.
Hold on, I'm not ready.
Network endpoint.
I thought he was going to say it needs a Wii again.
All right, give me the cloud.
So
Still not good.
it's still not very good. So for those of you wondering why we're laughing, to start the video off, Joe has to clap. He really isn't very good at clapping, we've realised, which, you know,
No.
cybersecurity expert can't clap for his life.
Well, this is the thing. Somebody once said Pink Floyd were the spokespeople of disappointment. I wonder if actually it's cybersecurity professionals.
That would not surprise me in the least, mate. So I think just sort of trying to group together all of the different concepts we've got in cybersecurity. I think there are 5 main categories that are probably worth a bit of discussion. And I think the 5 would be network security, because that has a particular thing about it, endpoint security, identity management, data security, which is getting more and more relevant, and obviously more recently, cloud security.
Yeah.
So I think if we step through each of those and maybe have a chat about the different aspects and things that procurement people might buy or get involved in buying as part of each of those. So my understanding of network security is it's probably a bunch of tools and bits of software. I've just realized I'm in a shallow bit. Tools and bits of software that protect your network.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fairly self-explanatory. Can you give us a couple of examples of the sort of things, sort of high level products and services that people might be looking at for network security in cyber terms?
Yeah. So firewalls, obviously, which we've already covered. So that's a device at the traditional perimeter, just behind any telecoms equipment that brings in a circuit that connects you to the outside.
So for those of the non-technical side of things, a firewall is, as it sounds, it's a thing a device that blocks certain types of networking of information that comes into the entity.
Allows only trusted traffic through and tries to block all other suspect or malicious traffic, essentially.
So in the same way you'd have a big access door in your building, it's like a big access door for your network.
Yeah.
Only lets certain things in.
It can also be used to host something called a virtual private network, which is often used, or traditionally used to be used by people connecting in remotely or from home, and then they would have all their traffic encrypted through a tunnel, and then the real traffic is inside but can't be eavesdropped upon or sniffed by any bad actors.
People connecting via a VPN from home, which most people are doing these days.
Yeah.
That's how it works. It basically is connecting to a firewall, and the firewall checks to make sure you're okay.
Increasingly, that's transparent. That's set up by your IT department, and you don't have any say in whether you use it or not. There's certain odd exceptions of traffic that can't use it, like Apple's App Store, for instance, but most things can happily use a VPN. And
as we got more and more advanced, firewalls, you can do more and more clever things with them, can't you? So the sort of endpoint, the network security can do things like you said before, behavioral analysis and check patterns and stuff like that. So as a buyer, your network security is, I mean, it's more than just firewalls. What other sort of things are there that in the network security?
And some of these can be in the quote-unquote box with the firewall appliance, typically a rack-mounted box that will go into a rack. You might see intrusion detection systems, which are looking for someone who's actually broken in and sort of sounding the alarm. Then the step beyond that is an intrusion prevention system, which is trying to block that traffic. And the debate with those is always, how worried are we that we might actually block real traffic with an IPS? So people can be quite nervous about using them. So again, all of these devices, all these network devices, are all logging what's going on independently. They all have to be on the same time, so they have to get time synchronization from somewhere. And all these logs tend to end up in something called a SIEM, or Security Incident and Event Management Platform, so that you can see all the events in chronological order. So if something did get through that was malicious, and you want to see where's that come from, and what is it, and what are they trying to hit, and it may be some area of the firewall that you've left unsecured, You need the SIEM in order to look at the events in order to see, well, they went here, they got through this rule, they were accepted, then they got to these machines, then they were on that machine and they were sweeping that network, maybe in a demilitarized zone, which is the first network that they would typically come to after they get through a firewall.
Perfect. So network security is really, so a firewall speaks of hardware generally,
Yes.
and it would feed something like it's SEIMs, security incident event management or the monitoring tool.
Yes.
And that SIEM tool would give you effectively the history of what's happened in that situation to allow people to work out what to do about it or who to blame, I suppose. And,
Yes, and the evolution of SIEM, because SIEM is quite old, maybe 20, 25 years at least, SIEMs have been around. Names like QRadar and Splunk are typically used. These days, people talk about buying an XDR, so extended detection and response. And this is usually little more than a SIEM with various other data feeds brought in to enrich the data that you're seeing and or to give you additional dashboards to help you make sense of what you're seeing.
Right, yeah.
So it might be identity feeds. So if a user is coming in, right, look at that user, what is that user's role, who is that user's manager? Based on what we know about the role, should they be coming in through the network at 11 p.m. at night? So that's user behavioral analysis. And there are other tools that specialize in that, but you could use UBA type techniques against what the XDR SIEM is telling you. So there's all that. That's another avenue of conversation.
What makes me chuckle about cyber is you really quickly get into acronyms. The whole industry is built on complicated words, isn't it?
It can be, and this is a bit like buying hi-fi in the 1980s, whereas if you didn't...
Either, Jeff. I'm going to keep saying it.
And if you didn't know what these things were, then basically the salesman could convince you to buy pretty much anything. And you would buy it because you didn't want to feel silly.
So from a procurement standpoint, making sure you are comfortable in asking questions to ensure you understand what you're getting and what all the terminology means is quite important.
And making sure your advisors are willing to take the time to demystify what it is they're trying to buy.
Yeah.
And they don't engage at a level where if you're non-technical, you shouldn't even be in the room, which some techies are guilty of.
Yes, I know that.
You've
for a
probably
fact.
run into that before.
I have met a few of those. So network security gives you a load of tools to protect people from getting into your world, network level. The next sort of classification is endpoint security. Now, in my simple world, that is antivirus, or is it more complex than that?
It certainly started off as antivirus, but then it turns into any application which you could turn an agent to, which improves security. And these tools keep evolving. So things like data loss prevention, which could be rule-based, tied to what regulations say you should or shouldn't do.
So can we explore that? Because data loss prevention I know a little bit about. So basically that is, you have a set of rules in your IT estate and it's looking at what's leaving your network. You know, someone's putting a USB key into their PC.
Yeah, that's the other aspect, is blocking unauthorized storage or any use of removable storage.
Or even checking what's being put on that USB key or whatever to validate they're not downloading the company secrets and to take them away. So there's different levels of data.
You do have legitimate use cases in like the defense industry where we have lots of air gap networks because of the problems with everything being connected that we've already talked about. And you have managed USB storage devices where they can track chain of custody between different individuals or between different companies that have a need to know. Could be weaponizable information or all kinds of other situations.
So endpoint wise, and so you've got different types of endpoints. You've got your PCs and your laptops, which everyone will know, and we've got endpoint protection like antivirus and data loss prevention and those sorts of tools.
Yeah.
You've got mobiles these days, which are a lot more prominent.
Yes.
What sort of security do people wrap around mobiles these days?
Okay, so there's broadly two categories. There's, in terms of the software tools, mobile device management, which allows you to really control pretty much all the settings that have been exposed by the phone vendor. So this could control even which applications are installed. It could even treat it almost like a kiosk, where maybe it can only run 1 or 2 applications. And a very basic free version of that is a tool called Apple Configurator, which can be used to make a series of cloned iPhones or iPads, for instance, which I've seen used in retail environments for product demos. Actually being able to walk up to a customer and show them, rather than have a counter in between you and the customer, which is seen as keeping them sort of arm's length. So retail people don't like that so much. More common in most people's day-to-day lives in office work is mobile application management, which is putting some Chinese walls around certain standard applications like Microsoft Outlook or Microsoft Teams or Slack or Google Workspace, things like that.
Anywhere where people are conversing or
yeah, and then you're concerned about, you want them to be empowered to communicate and collaborate. You don't want them sharing company domain documents or data, or even maybe screenshots, and putting them on locally on the device where they're then uncontrolled. It could be shared via Gmail or something like that.
Yeah, understood. So are there any other types of endpoints that we'd need to think about? I mean, you've got things like operational technology, so manufacturing devices and those sorts of things, which have got, and I remember back in the old days, there's a very famous hack where US government, I believe, or some nation state hacked an engineering platform in Iran to play with their nuclear reactor stuff.
Stuxnet.
Exactly that. So it's not just PCs and mobile phones. Obviously, your whole estate from a procurement perspective, you need to consider anything that's either attached to the network or attached to the...
I mean, it has to also be said that those things are very, very few and far between.
Yeah, of course.
And it's extremely expensive exploit to undertake and to plan.
Yeah.
So things like that, and the thing that the Israelis did with the pages that all detonated in people's pockets, all at a predetermined interval, and they'd actually sold via a shell company all these pages.
Brilliant.
Using a design that had been basically gone out of business.
Not brilliant at a moral level, but clever technically.
Very intricate and devious and clever.
Yeah. So the next category, if you like, is identity and access management.
Yes.
Now, I think most people probably use this all the time. This is things like Active Directory and those sorts of products. But how do they sort of generally hang together, those sorts of tools?
So Active Directory appeared in the year 2000, and the idea is to have a central directory of all your users and computers and other devices that are on the network. Novell was the leader in that space. Prior to that, Active Directory's real innovation was it was easier to manage and build out a, if you like, global directory service. What unfortunately has tended to happen is that when people want to be in charge of their own domain within a division of a company or an operating company, is they'll build another directory and another directory. And so you quite quickly get to a scenario where there might be 30 or 40 or even more Active Directories in a large enterprise, especially if they've grown through mergers and acquisitions.
So Active Directory is obviously a well-known tool for IAM, Identity and Access Management. Is there anything else that people need to consider if they're buying those sorts of tools?
Yes. So with more and more SaaS service, so software as a service, i.e. web portals for cheap, getting access to different applications and solving different problems, and they're pretty much out there for any industry at this point. They often use something called single sign-on. This is a method of basically trusting the credential you've already supplied to log onto your work computer or laptop, and basically using that as your source of identity.
So I've logged on as Phil onto my laptop. Well,
I've made a claim that I am Phil. The other end, the application, validates the claim and makes the final decision as to whether you're then logged in. And the reason why this is better is because the alternative is to have people log in again with another username and password, which people don't like, because it obviously creates friction. If you've got half a dozen or more of these tools that you have to use regularly. And second of all, it's local accounts that you then need to manage, and you may not have any additional tooling that allows you to manage those local accounts in those SaaS platforms. So that means people end up moving on to a different role or leaving the company. The account is still there. Somebody else resets the password, does something they shouldn't do, masquerading as that person who's left the business. So then there's no attribution maybe to the person who did it. So the SSO helps massively with the attribution as well, because you can trace it back to the...
Would you classify multi-factor authentication, those little dongles and tools and things on people's phones, would that fall into the identity access management?
That is another source of corroborating the identity, so another factor. So it used to be you had RSA tokens that you put on your car keys years ago. These days,
some clients still use that.
They might still have them if the batteries are still good. So I mean, that's possible. In effect, that technology still exists on most of the more modern equivalents. So more often these days, you might have Okta Verify as an app on your phone. The nice thing about MFA services that are running on your phone is you can get other transparent credentials, such as the device ID of the phone, maybe. So it's like, this is the same phone that individual used yesterday. So again, it's another backup factor to say this is that person.
It's very likely to be that person because it's
much
the same,
more likely. You can also get
the same location and
yeah, if the software supports it, the MFA software, you might even be able to get a Face ID challenge that's done as well. You might also get the GPS location of the phone, which, because if people are working from home and they use their local router to connect into the business, the internet service provider, where their traffic pops out and goes onto the general internet, can change because they have multiple points of presence that they would use. So you can't say if it's this external IP, that must be Joe over in Southampton, because I might pop out in Worthing or I might pop out in Bristol or something like that. So I need other factors because the ISP is helping you evade some of that tracking.
Gotcha. So identity and access management, there's quite a lot there, but it's all about trying to confirm the person who's accessing the system is the person who's accessing the...
The other thing which we need to talk about on that is privileged access management, which is mainly concerned with removal of standing access.
Okay.
So back when I was an infrastructure guy doing IT administration, I had an account which had full privileges, access to everything, etc. And that was there all day, every day, regardless of whether I needed to do anything. And certainly in more sensitive industries or regulated industries, they're much more interested now in having any privileged operations go through a privileged access management tool, such as CyberArk, Beyond Trust, Delinea, etc. And there's plenty of other ones now for different price points and so on. And this gives you the ability to elevate your privileges to make a production change or to log on to something sensitive. And then as soon as you finish that session, your privileges drop back to where they were before.
Right, gotcha, okay.
And this also allows for a very sensitive production change, a 4 eyes technique, where somebody else joins the session and observes what you do and can pause your access at any point. So,
right. So
an example there is a system security specialist may oversee an SME from a supplier, so a subject matter expert from a supplier, making a change on a highly sensitive production system, like something that monitors the electricity grid around here, for instance.
Yeah. Okay, so there's layers on layers within that one, I would have thought. I suppose data security is the next sort of big clump we were going to talk about. And we've covered off data loss prevention.
Yes.
Are there any other sort of main... I mean, obviously, everything's encrypted these days, and that's something to sort of factor into, you know, garbled up with a password so people can't see into it. Is there any other sort of major
Yeah, the other major one is GDPR was launched as a general data protection regulation in 2016, bringing together, I think, 27 different per European country regulations into one, with the idea of making it simpler, but also more enforceable. So then that defines various roles in there. And the key one for most people would be whether or not they are a data owner or not. And if there are, in the absence of any tools or anybody admitting to being the data owner for something, generally it's the managing director of a business that would be the de facto data owner for any data that that division or operating company was working on. So there are tools out there that try to assert who the data owner is if nobody's putting their hand up. So tools like Varonis, for instance, who will look at who modifies the documents with greatest regularity. Now, if it's a toss-up between 3 or 4 people, that's obviously not an exact science. At least you can then establish the data protection officer, who usually reports up through the legal team in a business, can then go and interview those people and meet with those people. Which one of you is really the data owner here? That kind of thing.
Where you're buying a tool like that, that's sort of protecting you from GDPR and stuff like that, this might be a not you question, but to what extent can you lay off the risk of things like GDPR and stuff like that to those sorts of tools? Have you ever, is that not really your bag?
I've done some work with that. That part solves a specific problem, which is who is actually the owner for this, and especially if it contains personal identifiable information, PII. The DPO themselves would typically have a tool such as OneTrust provides, because GDPR is a huge number of different articles, and a lot of them are to do with fulfilling obligations. So if somebody makes a subject access request and says, I believe you're holding data about me, they have 72 hours to turn around a response and to then optionally delete the data if that's what the person's asking for in a letter. So a tool like OneTrust would go further than what Varonis can do and allow you to manage all the workflows around surviving from a GDPR regulations point of view.
Sorry, I'm just giving an eye on the depth.
Like a plumber fitting a bathroom, you can't do it with one spanner.
Yeah.
You would potentially need a number of tools, depending on which role we're talking about. And then from a procurement point of view, it's like, well, how many people need access to the tools? How many licenses do we need? Is it licensed according to how many users' data we're trying to protect? Or is it licensed according to how many named users or concurrent users will use the tool? And all of that's going to radically affect the price.
Yeah. So in data security, I mean, look, most of these tools, by the sound of things, are licensed by user or licensed by function, and so the procurement people need to make sure they're into the depth of that with their SMEs,
yes,
and ensure that they can hit the right functional specs. So I think the final sort of relatively new category, I suppose, is cloud security, and that's probably the most complex, I would guess, because there's a lot of considerations there. I mean, do you want to give us a little summary of the sort of things you need to think about when cloud security?
So I mean, essentially, it's looking at vulnerabilities, which is one or more missing patches and one or more misconfigurations, and that is what's known as a vulnerability, which is given a number formally by a numbering authority. This will be a CVE number.
Okay.
Common vulnerability enumeration, right? And there are databases of these, and significantly, just yesterday, the European copy of this database went live, and this is quite a watershed moment because we've never felt like we needed our own, as in Europe-wide, vulnerability database before, because the US government funded NIST and MITRE managed CVE database has been like I hate to use this American word, bellwether, but it's always been there for many, many years. But recently their funding was in question because of Doge.
Lovely.
And they were examining alternatives, and NIST has actually had funding challenges over the years anyway, and has tried a few other things, but ENISA, who is the European equivalent, of NIST has come up with an operational, like it went live yesterday, CVE database that companies can also tap into for details of what is this vulnerability, how severe is it, what sort of additional threats are prevalent here. I mean, does it lead to loss of data? Is it an easy exploit? Is the exploit available publicly? All of these additional factors.
I know cloud security is really important. We've just pulled up at the pub.
Yes,
Should we stop and have a pint and
yes,
work out what we're going to do next?
of course.
Okay.